Okay, welcome to your next set of Cornell notes. Today we're talking about the causes of the Civil War. There's two slideshows that deal with the causes of the Civil War. This one, we talk more about the issue of slavery and how that divided the states, and then some important individuals who speak out against slavery. All right, so first, we need to reestablish that slavery started way back in the Jamestown colony in America in 1619. So slavery had been around for over 200 years by the time the Civil War breaks out. It was an established piece of America, of the American economy. Northern states, though, quickly end slavery. Sure, some wealthy New England families kept a slave or two, but the idea of having large amounts of slaves didn't really catch on in the North because it wasn't needed as much. But huge number of slaves arrived in the South from Africa until 1808 when the slave trade ended. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the different constitutional compromises. In the late 1700s, slavery was on the decline, right? So tobacco had been the big crop that slaves would harvest, but over time, the process became refined enough where there wasn't a need for as many slaves. However, Eli Whitney invents this thing called the cotton gin, and that changes everything. So, some southern farmers grew cotton, which took a lot of manual labor, right? You'll see in class, we'll actually pick through some cotton. You'll be able to feel the seeds and how labor-intensive that was. So cotton wasn't a big crop. But when the cotton gin comes out, guys, gin is just short for engine. But when the cotton gin came out, it sorted the seeds from the cotton and all of a sudden made it possible for anyone to really supply cotton to factories in the North. This made it very profitable. So after this cotton gin came out, cotton, the price goes up, right? Everyone wants to grow it. So most plantations switch from growing tobacco, rice, indigo, things like that to cotton. A majority of plantations now in the South are growing cotton, and they need slaves to produce more and more of this cotton so that they can make more and more money. So new demand for slaves meant that the buying and selling of slaves grew, especially from 1830 to 1861. 15 southern states became very dependent on slavery in order to make their money. So there were 15 slave states by the time the Civil War rolls around, and they have to have slaves to keep up their economy. In any area of the country where cotton was able to grow, right, you can't really grow cotton in the North, those are the same places that allowed slavery. Okay, there was kind of a hand-in-hand relationship, including some new western places, right? Some of those territories we talked about out west that had been established, you could grow cotton there. So then the issue became, can we allow slavery to go to these new territories, or should it just stop with the 15 states that currently have it? All right, so which was not an impact of the cotton gin? Made sorting cotton seeds easier, increased demand for slaves, gave slaves more free time, and increased the plantation's profits. And you would think in a perfect world that, it would have given slaves more free time, but really it just makes them able to produce even more in the time that they're out there working. By 1860, how many states legally allowed slaves? 6, 10, 11, or 15? And at the time of the Civil War, right, there were 15 states that allowed slavery. Okay, now, switching gears and looking at some individuals who were anti-slavery, right, and created waves in the American public, right, spread the message of the anti-slavery movement. These people are called abolitionists because they wanted to abolish the practice of slavery. The first one we're going to talk about is this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin portrays the harsh reality of slavery. So it's a work of fiction, but it is based on true accounts of slaves. Even though Harriet Beecher Stowe herself had never really firsthand experienced plantation life, she knew a lot about it from reading and research and things like that. So the book becomes the best-selling novel of the century. The only other book at all that sells more copies in the 1800s is the Bible. So everyone in the North just about read this book. People in the South burned it, right? Called it propaganda, didn't like it. People in the North couldn't get enough of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Whether or not this is true, but the historic rumor is that when Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, he says something to the extent of, "Oh, you're the little woman that started this great war." Right? Her book was incredibly influential on the American public. All right, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave. He was a slave in Maryland who escapes and ends up going to the North, right? He lives in New York and in New England. He starts an abolitionist newspaper called the Northern Star in Rochester, New York, which is also where he's buried, and it's widely read throughout the North. He also becomes kind of the voice of the African-American people in America at the time. Abraham Lincoln meets him on several occasions. He goes to the White House to discuss African-American issues and try to shape policy towards both slaves and free blacks after the Civil War. Okay, here's a quick little biography of Frederick Douglass.
Douglass's life sort of stands across the expanse of the 19th century as a symbol of the worst and the best in the American character. He was the slave who saw most of the worst brutalities of slavery. He was the slave, however, who freed himself and by luck, pluck, and gifts remade himself. Most importantly, he had an enormous ability to capture in words the meaning of what America is about.
I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. Frederick Douglass, 1845.
It was along the eastern shore of Maryland near a quiet creek called the Tuckahoe that the life of the man who would inspire a nation began.
Frederick Douglass was born in Talbot County on Maryland's eastern shore. He wasn't certain of his birth himself. In fact, he thought that he had been born in 1817.
But slave records tell of the birth of Frederick Augustus to a slave named Harriet in February 1818.
He knew who his mother was, although she was a distant figure in his life. She lived on another plantation. He never really knew who his father was, although he came to believe that his father was definitely a white man and probably his master.
Raised by his grandmother at the far end of the plantation, the tiny boy named Frederick led a carefree, playful life along the muddy shores of the Tuckahoe until he was 6.
At about age 6, Douglass found his childhood come to an abrupt end. He was assigned to act as the companion and caretaker of the child of the owner of the plantation. And as a result, he could get in trouble for things that he either had done or had failed to do. And so it became immediately apparent that he was no longer a child, but was a slave and was part of that institution of slavery.
Okay, so that's just a little bit about Frederick Douglass's life. Like I said, as an adult, he ends up escaping, writing books that founds that abolitionist newspaper, and even meets with Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so the next person, he's not so much an abolitionist, but just somebody who there's a big event surrounding, who abolitionists rally behind. And that is Dred Scott, kind of an interesting name. The Dred Scott decision refers to a Supreme Court decision. What ends up happening is that this guy here was born a slave, okay? And he moves with his owner to Illinois. Now, generally, that wouldn't be a big deal, except if you look at our slave-free state map here, right? He lives in this area here, and he goes with his owner to Illinois, then up into Wisconsin. These are free states. So law had already established that even if you travel with your owner to a free state, you're still a slave. However, what ends up happening is his owner dies while he's up here in the free states. So he feels that he should be free because now he's in a free state. The Supreme Court, however, felt differently. And the Supreme Court decides that he needs to be returned into slavery, right, with his owner's heirs, right, in, I believe, Kentucky or someplace. And what this did is it really ended up infuriating the North, right? They were very upset by this court decision, right? The South praised it and said, good, he's property, he should not have been freed. The North just sends all kinds of money at this guy, right, to try to get him to buy his freedom, which eventually happens. So he does, both him and his wife end up dying free. However, there's this huge court decision and all this media hoopla surrounding this case where the Supreme Court rules against him. Okay, the next guy is this guy named John Brown. John Brown is a little nuts. He's more of a radical abolitionist. We'll talk a little bit about John Brown when we talk about Bleeding Kansas, but really John Brown comes to his end at this raid on Harper's Ferry. He decides that he's going to storm a military arsenal and steal weapons and give them to the nearby slaves. Harper's Ferry is now in West Virginia, but back then it was just all Virginia. If you go to Harper's Ferry, it's a beautiful place. It's down in this big valley, but there's a couple rivers that kind of come together in that little town. So it was a perfect place for the army to store weapons because they could then transport them up and down the rivers pretty easily. One of those rivers goes right into Washington, D.C., so it was kind of the perfect location. He believes that if slaves are armed, right, they will start in a new revolution. Nothing will make slaves be free faster than if they shoot and kill their owners. So him and his, I think, 5 sons storm this military arsenal. They are inside, ready to steal the weapons, and all of a sudden the U.S. Army, who now has gotten word of this, surrounds the arsenal, ends up killing his entire family except for him, right? Eventually they drag him out of the arsenal, and they put him on trial for treason, and he is put to death. In the North, he's kind of looked at as more of a martyr kind of figure. In the South, he's vilified as a traitor. So he's kind of a tragic end to this sort of unethical guy who really wants to use criminal acts to start a revolution of slaves. Okay, now let's match the following real quick. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a best-selling book about slavery. John Brown, he's the guy that raided the arsenal or weapons storage in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Harriet Beecher Stowe is the person who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Dred Scott was the controversial Supreme Court decision. And Frederick Douglass was the escaped slave who started a newspaper. Okay, and that's it for this week's notes. You only have 2 left after today. Don't forget to do your margins and your reflection.